Hello and welcome to another episode of the EV Charging Podcast. This is Dan.
And I'm Jeff.
And we're very excited to be back in the studio. It's been a whole month with our new format going from fortnightly to monthly. Our listeners are probably very pleased they've been given 40 minutes back per fortnight that they can use however they please.
Yeah, and look, and before we get too far ahead, this program is always brought to you by Solar Choice. We're Australia's online quote comparison tool for home electrification, which has been a busy space down lately.
Certainly has. I think the whole industry has been running off their feet with so many grant programs, particularly the federal battery rebate, which has kicked in not too long ago and has everyone absolutely flat out.
That's right. So this month we are talking with Scott Carden. He is the head of engineering at NRMA. Most people know NRMA as a roadside assistance group dating back a very long time in New South Wales, but they have built one of the largest public EV charging networks across Australia. And one of the things we really wanted to talk to Scott about was the Eldunda off-grid charging station, which was built a few years ago. It was a world first when it was built and made the headlines at that time and has been through some trials and tribulations since, so it's good to get Scott's perspective. And without further ado, let's get into the chat with Scott Carden. So to kick things off, Scott, obviously you're the head of engineering now for NRMA, but give us a bit of a backstory, like what led you to this current role?
Sure, that's a fun and varied career. So I didn't start university till much later in life, right? So I didn't graduate till I was 30. So before then I was, running my own IT business since I was like 13 years old, pulling apart computers on the lounge room floor and things like that. And then I did everything in between, managing a Macca's, being a brickies labourer, insurance claims, taxi driving, like you name it. I've done it, right?
Okay.
And then had a young family and thought, well, you're 25, you got to do something. And then thought, what can I do? I like tinkering with things. So jumped into engineering. I was in Toowoomba at the time. USQ had a really great mature age curriculum, all that kind of stuff. Did mechatronic engineering, loved every minute of it. Yeah, graduated when I was 30 and then went in, deep dive into doing lots of really, really cool, exciting things. So I've got I'm a mechatronic engineer, so I've got a background in control systems and electrical and a bit of mechanical and everything else. So I've done everything from process and control systems for gold mines to slave load shedding systems for frontline defense bases, power systems for hospitals, metering and communications for embedded networks in big high-rise buildings and everything else, and more recently into EV charging.
That is varied.
Yeah. So I think that background of, doing control systems, understanding how everything needs to interact, and you can't just take, all these different commercial off-the-shelf components and put them on a site and just cross your fingers and hope they're going to work, right? You need that integrated layer, especially when you start doing really complex things like the NRMA is doing for some of our sites. That's what it takes to make them reliable and everything else. So, that background, very diverse, doing lots of different things, I think has helped a lot.
A good case study for someone who's maybe 27, 28 and maybe hasn't found the right career yet to hear that everything's still possible, right? So it sounds like you've gone on and flourished from, sounds like a bit of a career shift at that midlife crisis, perhaps.
Hopefully 25 was midlife, right?
Quarter life, third of a life, something like that.
But I think what I'm really passionate about is, I've tried university when I was younger, didn't like it, all that kind of stuff, right? Found the sweet spot for me, which was, that bit older and everything else. But what I really like to do is to bring those graduate engineers along for that journey. I've done lots of everything in that electrical, mechanically type space and all that kind of stuff. And in all my past roles, it's, try and get as many graduates in as possible, teach them the right way to do things, get them to really sit back and look. Engineers love to go off on tangents, right? So you give an engineer a problem and they go, it's going to be this really crazy thing and I've got to do this amazing solution. And it's like, have you tried turning it on? Like, you got to go back to first principles all the time. It's right. I keep saying it to my young engineers, like, all right, yep, that sounds good. But back to first principles. Where do you start? What do you start looking at? Can we do a state diagram to work out exactly how things are supposed to work, and does that work out? And that often leads to, there's this and there's this and there's all these different things you didn't think about that are actually really important.
So what does a week look like or a day look like? You've got a new graduate who's joined your team, working at the NRMA. Is probably a pretty exciting role for someone coming out of mechatronics engineering course.
Yep.
What do you get them doing?
Throw them in the deep end.
Yeah.
No, there's lots of foundational work, right? So you give them a hint of all the really exciting stuff. You get them involved in those projects, right? And they can be a bit of the go through and gathering information and reviewing bits and pieces and all that stuff and providing their ideas up to the more senior engineers. But it's amazing how many times where you're in a technical meeting and everyone's, throwing out all these ideas and the graduate's like, oh, have you thought about this kind of thing? And they just haven't got any biases, right? They don't have all that background of, I've done this really amazing thing and it was always this complex problem. You had to do that. It's like, the really, really simple thing.
I think most people listening will be pretty familiar with NRMA, probably mostly from the beginnings of being the roadside assistance company. That's certainly my main knowledge of the NRMA, and I've been a member, and Dan's probably a member too, about both being in the New South Wales. So the scope of NRMA, however, has evolved, and obviously we're here talking about EV charging. What does the scope sort of broadly look like for the NRMA today?
Yeah, it was a bit of an eye-opener for me when I first joined because, like you said, right, everyone just associates with it. Roadside assistance, you got to have that. I grew up in New South Wales. I'm in Queensland now, but I grew up in New South Wales, so it was always, when you first start driving, you get NRMA roadside assistance because we're all driving that old banger that's going to break down every other week. But we do lots of different things. So, it's all about supporting our members for travel and movement all around Australia. So we've got tourism, we've got, holiday parks, we've got cruise lines, we've got all these different bits and pieces, plus the EV on top of all of that, right? So we're doing lots of different things. It's all about what we can do for our members to make sure that, they're safe wherever they go in Australia.
Interesting. So how does EV fit into the big picture? Obviously, there's more and more people buying EVs in Australia, and that's only going to keep going up. So does the NRMA see it part of its role as helping to fill out the national network and access to charging?
Yeah, I think that's a key one, right? It's the national network. So if you have a look from a commercial point of view, there's not too many CPOs that are going to say, we're going to make a lot of money by putting an EV charger in a really remote community. But if you want to foster EV charging, someone's got to do that. And as a mutual, we're backed by our members. We aren't trying to make money for our shareholders. We're trying to reinvest those funds back in to benefit all of our members and all of Australia. And so, we're in a position where we can do that. We can, do the hard yards, do some of these, I guess, being polite, less than commercial locations, but that fills a need, right? So now once that network's complete, you could go from Sydney to Perth, whichever way you want to go, right? Do you want to go up north through Queensland, across through the Northern Territory and do the long way around? Do you want to go through the heart of Australia? Whichever way you want to go, there's going to be the ability to charge and continue that journey, not get stuck.
Give us a bit of an idea of how many chargers you have out there, how many you've got, like how many is in the pipeline.
Yeah, so can't go into too harder numbers because it's always fluctuating, right? So what we found is, there's defined programs. So, the federal government has a program. We've got different state government programs and things like that. And so we have these numbers, but what we're also finding, some of these projects are quite long lead times and we don't want to overbuild certain scenarios. So, there might be a federal program that says you want to build in certain locations and then another government might come in and say they've got a program there. You don't want to put 2 high-speed charging spots in a one-horse town or something like that. So you've got to try to make sure everything's is right. And again, we don't want to be carrying the burden for all of these remote locations for everyone else. There needs to be some equity across that and, other CPOs.
Yeah, you're right. Like it's not your job solely to fill those gaps. And
correct.
But it is interesting that to have a player in that space that isn't, as you mentioned, like coming back to a profit drive where they need to achieve a certain return on capital and so having that different motivation, I think, serves to create a more balanced and fairer outcome for customers.
And so we're looking to balance out a network, right? So you would have seen we've done a lot of early works in New South Wales because New South Wales-based company, and so that's where our members are based. And so we did those early EV charger installations, those 50 kilowatt size chargers in a lot of areas. And then we expanded out and we started to go across Australia. We're trying to deploy EV charging every 150 kilometres along the major highways. So that's a big program. A lot of those sites will be in very regional, very remote locations. There's no power available. It doesn't make sense to deploy 250 kilowatt chargers in the middle of Australia, and you couldn't do it anyway. We're not putting in huge burdens on the network in locations that won't need that, and also looking to start deploying more metro locations so we can have a more commercial model across our whole portfolio. rather than have too many of the locations, those lower utilization sites, which I'm sure you can imagine do cost quite a lot to maintain and keep running.
Yeah, we've heard from other CPOs that often just the network charges and the cost to have a charger there, even if it's 0% utilization, can be quite significant.
Very much so. And as you get into more unique technologies because of the constraints on the site, right? So we might define a site as a very weak grid. So we do have some grid there, but maybe we can get 50 kilowatts. I mean, our program might say we need to deploy 150 kilowatts worth of charging infrastructure. So pretty easy to see that 50 doesn't equal 150. So what do? So you might have some integrated technologies in there with a battery to store that power and keep charging itself up and then be able to deploy lots of power over a short period. But that's a complex system, right? So it needs power to cool the batteries and needs power to maintain those systems. And if you're only getting one charge session a week or 3 a week, the costs of running or the energy taken to just keep the lights on and keep the system running might be more than the energy you're delivering to customers. So it's quite challenging.
Well, a lot of the things we've just touched on probably relate to a site that was recently pretty heavily publicised in the centre of Australia in Eldunda. Completely off-grid EV charger.
Yep.
That was, I believe, replacing a previous off-grid charging station that wasn't really operating as well as had been hoped. Can you tell us a bit more about what was originally in that site at Eldunda and what's been put in place recently and recently opened?
So it's lots of stories I could say about that, and there's enough to write a paper on, right? And funny enough, I am writing a paper on that. So
Great.
I'm going to be doing a white paper. I'm about halfway through, just to talk through the experience of what it takes to build one of these types of locations and the journey we've been on. And I guess you can go through the stages where you consider the first Eldunda site. I would call that an alpha product, right? If you're going back into programming type talk, didn't really know how it's all going to work together. We engage with a contractor and this is the alpha product. We've got to get something out there, see it work and see how it goes. And then we moved into what we'd call our beta product, which is at Nullarbor, right? So that's a revised product. There was a lot of learnings, lots of changes made to the system, primarily around how the integrations and things like that. And there were some limitations. And so we ran that for a while and thought, okay, yep, this is getting a lot better. We're using less of the secondary power sources like the backup generator and other bits and pieces, and we're getting a better experience, but there's still things we can change. And then we've arrived at I call it our release candidate, right? So this is Eldunda number 2. I'd call it a release candidate. It's pretty good. We've got most of the things ironed out. There's still a few tweaks and everything to be made, but that will then fall into our stable release. And that will be the standalone system that we can move forward with. The big changes really comes around the integration of those systems. So, you've got probably 5 different subsystems within that site. You've got your PV, you've got your battery, you've got your backup generator, you've got your energy management control system, and you've got your EV chargers. Now, if they're not all talking together, no happy days, right?
Yeah.
So just to clarify, there's no grid connection at all at any of these sites?
No. So that's a common misconception where customers might say, the older Eldunda system was offline and I just plugged into the power point at the Roadhouse.
The Roadhouse, yeah.
The Roadhouse is running off diesel generators, right? There is no grid there. It's just 2 big diesel generators running 24/7. So you have this off-grid system. You've got to get those integrations really, really tight. What happens is EV chargers were never made to integrate to control systems like that, right? So their protocols is OCPP. It's made for communicating with the cloud, getting some essentially slow signals to, yes, you can charge, no, you can't, not really too much more than that. But an EV charger can ramp up to 100% load in maybe a tenth of a second. A good BESS can probably follow closely to that, but maybe it takes half a second to a second to ramp up to full load. And a diesel generator is probably, if I'm generous, 10 seconds, maybe longer. If it's got to start, that could be a minute. So you see the discrepancy there. You've got a system that can demand power in 1/10 of a second. If it doesn't get it, voltage is going to drop, frequency is going to drop, it's going to trip out.
Right.
And you've got 2 other systems that are supporting that can't respond fast enough. So if you haven't got those tight integrations, you're in for a world of hurt. So,
So the original Eldunda site, what were those tritium chargers?
They were, yes.
Yeah, and 2 75 kilowatt tritium chargers, is that right?
Yeah, I think they were RTM 75s. Yep.
Yeah, okay. And alongside that, how big's the battery?
Oh, lots of fun stuff like that. So we would have liked to have a 200 kilowatt hour battery there. We end up getting about 120.
Okay.
And again, we don't want to go into too much nitpicking about the sites and anything like that, right? But the general reason why that site was not as reliable as we would have liked was there was not an overarching control system that could control the EV chargers. So the only way to get the system to allow the system to respond fast enough to those EV charge sessions was to lower that charging speed down. And you get to a certain point where if you lower it much further, there's, you might as well not be charging.
Right.
So, you got that discrepancy where the tritiums might ramp up in a tenth of a second. You can't really change that because the Tesla might pull up, and Teslas are really hard on EV chargers. They go, I want all the power and I want it yesterday. A Polestar is quite polite. It comes along and it requests energy ramping up nicely and all that stuff. And we saw that during the testing. I think one of the funny catches we got was when we were doing the first lot of testing on that site, we used Polestars because that's what we could get.
Right.
And everything worked perfectly. And then the first Tesla turns up and it demand power a lot quicker and the whole system fell over. And, a lot of scratching heads. Well, why is that different? It's 2 EV. Everything was the same. It's just the cars demanded their power in different steps and it was enough to pull down the system.
And those sorts of considerations are obviously far from the minds of the average consumer who just thinks of their EV as an electrical appliance. You plug it in, you press go, it's on. But
exactly. That's what we see and this is a failing on us, right? We haven't educated the community enough. We can't expect that every consumer, every person that turns up at Eldunda is an electrical engineer with 20 years controls experience and just intuitively knows that we need to treat it a bit gently. And, if there was 4 charge sessions before, it's likely that the generator is going to start up. Or, if it was cloudy the last couple of days and all that kind of stuff, right? They don't have that intuitive knowledge and we shouldn't expect that they do. So, there's definitely an education piece that's on us. We can definitely do better at that.
The initial site, I think I'm correct in saying, had some Commonwealth government support.
Yes.
And I think if I read correctly, it was a world first in terms of off-grid charging station of that size and capacity. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So it's still something to be proud of, right? Even though it's been replaced, it was a world first and we were setting the standard and we learned a lot from it. We wouldn't be where we are today for those standalone systems if we didn't do that first site, right? So lots of learning came from that. And then when we started building the next generation, we took that all on board. So at that point in time, there weren't any commercially available chargers, at least none that we had onboarded, that could have an alternative control source rather than OCPP.
Yep.
So that Nullarbor, the beta product was trying to do control over the cloud back to the chargers. So when communication was really good, it worked. If you have a bit of an interruption to that 4G connection or there's a bit of a hiccup somewhere, then, the cloud platform might think the charger's in one state, the charger's in a different state, and the system's trying to do something else, and it all ends in tears. And so we looked at that and said, okay, well, everything else is starting to work really good. I made a few changes in the PV and the batteries and tunings and how everything responds. And, when the control system's working right, we're getting really good outcomes. And it's like, okay, how do we just nail that last step? And that's when we found another charger that was looking pretty good and it had Modbus local control.
Okay. Which charger is that?
So that's the Sinexcel.
Okay.
SAC80s. And so we worked with a local distributor, got access to those, did some testing, and Modbus is a nice, easy protocol. I've been using that for 15, 16 years in controlling systems. Every control system can talk Modbus. And all of a sudden, you went from having to send signals to the cloud, get a response back, modify you, to having instantaneous local control. And so you get much better outcomes.
So is the EV charger communicating directly with the battery management system, or is there a third-party control device somewhere in there that's the brains?
So there's a EMCS, so Energy Management Control System.
Okay.
That's taking inputs from everything, right? So from a radiance meter to monitor how the solar should be performing, to data from the solar panels, to data from the battery, diesel generator, all the breakers, energy meters, and the 2 EV chargers. So it's taking all that information in and they're making decisions as to how I should set those chargers up. And so by having that local control, you can set those chargers to initially only deliver, maybe 5 kilowatts, right? Enough to get a charge session started, but not enough to overcome any one of the systems if there was a fault.
Right.
And then once the system's performing stably, you can increase that. And you go, okay, I'll release another 10 kilowatts, for example. Everything stabilizes, the system's performing nicely. Okay, I can release another 10 kilowatts, and you can keep doing that up to the limit. Then if another car comes up and wants to charge, the system detects that. Okay, I'll drop the first charge session by a few kilowatts and I'll start the second one up and start balancing things out. With that local control, you can get really granulated control over the whole system. And now instead of having On the original system, maybe I'll be generous, one charge session that's reliable. Now we can have 4 charge sessions simultaneously at that site. They won't be getting a truckload of power, right? We've got to balance the available power of the system, but you can handle 4 charges.
Oh, that's the same as any grid-connected charger anyway.
That's doing load management,
Yeah, through load management. And it sounds like the control system is forcing the Tesla to be the Polestar and to sort of be more gentle to the
Exactly. So you're setting out the charge, and now you've made the charge at the control point, the source of truth as to what's going on, and the car can say, hey, I'm ready to charge and I can take 200 kilowatts. The car's like, well, sorry, you got 5. All right, now you can have 15. Okay, we're going good. All right, let's take it to 30.
Nice to hear that Australia's leading the way on this, because it feels like it, with a lot of things in electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging, we're kind of lagging behind in terms of adoption, in terms of, sort of even just having all the vehicles come to Australia. We seem to be a few months behind everyone. So nice for us to be sending some technology out the other way. And,
it's really good.
It is a double-edged sword though, right? Like we get to learn the lessons faster that have gone through Europe, 10 years ago. Yeah. But in this case, you had to learn some of the lessons yourself.
There's some interesting journeys that Europe's gone through, right? So I've done a few trips overseas and talked to a lot of CPOs over there. And they're all really want to help out the CPOs in Australia, right? They see us as, the younger sibling, they don't want us to make the same mistakes. We're no competition to them, right? So they've been very free and open with the information. Don't do this. It sounds good, but don't do that. Oh, this sounds pretty good. Oh, that's really cool what you're doing, all that kind of stuff. So lots of free and open discussions between us all. And it's a really good collaborative environment.
I mean, we've said Eldunda 10 times in this conversation. I realise a lot of our audience may have no idea where we're actually talking about.
It's the dead centre of
basically
Australia.
The very middle, right? Yep. People on their way out to Uluru or between Alice and Uluru, people driving from Darwin down to South Australia or vice versa. They're all crossing through Eldunda.
Yep.
Are we likely to see more sites like this rolled out in the next few years?
Definitely. So we've got quite a few in the build right now. We'll have one out at Uluru pretty soon. I'll have a few more out along that journey, because if you have a look at the grid map of Australia, it kind of all ends very close to the major cities and all that kind of stuff. There's just no power available out there. And when there is power, right, it's because there's a township that's run off diesel generators and they can't handle having EV charging put on there anyway, unless you're spending millions of dollars on upgrading the control systems and the generators themselves. So there's definitely going to be a few more out there, and they'll be our next generation as well. So if you've seen Eldunda or you've seen Nullarbor, there's this quite impressive big steel skid structure with fold-out wings for the solar and everything else. And that was a really good idea to get things moving quickly, but we've kind of worked out, well, it's really difficult getting a 100-ton crane out into the middle of Australia to drop these off and to fold the wings out and all that kind of stuff. So we're moving away from that type of solution for our stable release product. And
still keeping solar?
Yeah, there's still definitely solar. Yep. It's going to be more like a solar carport type solution.
Okay.
That allows more expansion. So one of the big problems is you can make these systems really, really reliable if you had no end to the amount of land you could use, right? So if you want to deploy 50 kilowatts worth of solar, and I'm talking to the experts, right? So, that's about a tennis court worth of solar. Even when you're out in the middle of Australia, it looks like there's lots of land everywhere, but none of that's commercially available. So if you go to a roadhouse, they're not going to give up all their campgrounds for you to put solar down to make your system really reliable. So you're limited to the amount of space you can use. And that's one of the unavoidable truths, I think, around deploying these sites. It looks like there's lots of land, but none of it's available to you.
I'm glad you said that, Scott. There's the one thing that struck me when looking at these sites, and our audience go look at images of these sites. There's a solar carport sitting above a battery and the charging station, but the size of the solar array always seemed a bit small in comparison to what the battery must be sized at. So I guess with potentially low utilization at these sites, it may take, multiple days to kind of get the battery back up to 100%.
What we see is the dip in best power from, or best state of charge from a charge station isn't that great. So the new ones we're deploying have about 200 kilowatt hours worth of usable storage. And realistically, the average charge session, even in these really remote locations, is only just above 30 kilowatt hours.
Okay.
So it's not taking a huge hit out of those systems. So if the timing's right, so, if we get a couple of charge sessions that happen during the day and then maybe a couple at night, the backup generation won't run. The system's able to handle those 3 or 4 charge sessions in a day. And then if we have no customers for a couple of days, it's perfectly fine to catch back up. And when you look at it, a lot of these sites might only be getting 6 to 12 charge sessions a week. They're quite spread out, so we'll have plenty of times where everything's happy. We've got nice lots of sun. It's about 26 odd kilowatts worth of solar on these original versions, and we're only, even on a sunny day, maybe there's 10 kilowatts worth of power coming in the system because it's basically full, and it's happy days. I think one of the other big learnings was you got to pay a lot of attention to how you set these systems up because those standby loads are huge.
Right.
So on the original Eldunda, 20% of the battery would go overnight, just keeping it turned on overnight.
Wow.
And so a lot of careful consideration was made as to, so how do we set up the cooling systems, right? Should we have AC connected to DC connected cooling systems? What do we do here for the PVs, AC or DC coupled, the generator, what's the best way to do things and all that kind of stuff? And we've gone through a few different iterations.
So apart from off-grid setups, what else is your engineering team looking at? What other projects are they across?
Oh, everything. So there's the nice, I'll say easy sites, but nothing's ever easy. So, grid connected site, plenty of power available and all that stuff. We have a bit of a joke within the team that we have these unicorn sites. There's 300 kilowatts available. Everything's looking great. We can just go in there, plug in EV chargers, walk away. It's going to be amazing. And every time someone dares mention the word unicorn, that turns out to be a donkey with an ice cream cone stuck to its head. It's never the case, right? So, you might see a site where there's plenty of available power, but the switchboard's non-compliant and the original customer has 3 separate connections, and now the DNSP says, actually, you got to consolidate all that into a single connection. You're going to have to upgrade the switch, all this kind of stuff. And what you thought was going to be a free ride all of a sudden turns into a $300,000 problem or something like that. So there's always those challenges.
Yeah, interesting.
What are the fastest chargers you're putting in at the moment? I see a lot of the 50 kilowatts still around, but
we're putting out most of those old tritiums. So there shouldn't be too many 50 kilowatts left. The slowest charge we'd be deploying now would be the around 80 kilowatts, aside from when we're putting in some AC chargers for backup purposes or for that, long dwell time and all that kind of stuff. But typically for high-speed charging, 80 kilowatts will be the slowest. About 180 is the bread and butter, and whether that's running 180 or maybe down to 150, depending on the available grid power. And then we do quite a few 360 kilowatt chargers. But even then, we don't see that throughput of power. So I think on our 360 kilowatt chargers, probably the highest speed last time I checked that we've ever seen on them was about 278 kilowatts. And then the average for that whole charge session was only about 120 kilowatts.
We've talked about this before, but we're seeing that some extremely high charging possibilities are on the way in terms of BYD, talking about 1,000 kilowatts. And I think there was other companies doing even higher than that. Is that something that's on the radar?
Oh, this is the bit that gives me nightmares, right? Because, as we start moving into more, solid state batteries and all that stuff, that's the next generation, the next exciting point in this industry. We get to that, we start to see, much higher charging speeds, sustained high charging, which is a big thing. And then I dread the time where I've got to call a DNSP and say, can I get 2 meg at this site? They've got to stop taking my phone calls pretty soon. But it'll be an exciting challenge, right? That's what engineers live for. It's, the exciting thing. How do we manage this? There's going to be that point where you've got to make sure that you have enough power going to the site they can handle those peaks. So, I went really high and I went really low very quickly.
And it's a good reminder to people who are new to EVs or thinking about buying their first EV that the charging speed capability of the car isn't necessarily the best metric for them. But looking at user reviews or looking at the someone who's actually taken one for a drive and says this is how long it takes from 20 to 80%, for example, because that's how long they're going to be drinking their coffee for, not necessarily the top line speed for 30 seconds.
Exactly, yeah. And there's plenty of cars that actually charge faster and they have a much lower head speed of accepting charge, but they have that longer sustained charge speed. So,
Have you made the leap yourself to an EV, Scott?
I got one of the first Atto 3s that came out.
Oh,
so
very
I've done
good.
80,000 Ks in it so far.
Yeah, very good. I've done about, I think, 60,000 on mine. So I've got an Atto 3 as well.
Yeah.
But I must have been a little bit behind you.
No, I just drive a lot.
And have you made the trip from Brisbane down to Sydney?
Yeah, I've done that a couple of times. I go up north to Agnes Water and things like that and go out bush. So my parents are out bush off grid and I drive no worries out there and then take my little granny charger with me and plug in to get a top up so I can get to the next high-speed charge on the journey home and never had any issues. I've been a bit silly a few times and come down to 0% state of charge and just coasted into home. But it's fine.
I had a very close call. It was probably about 6 months ago. I was coming up to the farm at Byron Bay, and the odometer was saying I had about 12%, and then somehow it went sort of 11. I got looking at it very closely at 10, and then it went from 7 to 0, just like that. And all my buffer had disappeared, and it went down to snail speed. So I think in the BYD, it goes down to 70. So everyone's zooming past me on the freeway. I've got the AC turned off. Everything's fogging up, and I've got my wife and the baby in the back. And so we made it, just pulled into the NRMA charger at the farm and got enough to get us back home. So, but yeah, it can be quite stressful without the network there to support you.
Yeah. And it's interesting, so with the lithium iron phosphate batteries, right, they like to go, well, you need to take them up to 100% and down to as close as you can to 0 to reset that calculation, because it's a very flat voltage curve. You can't really say, if it's at X volt, it's going to be 43% state of charge. They're doing all these calculations, and they need that ability to kind of reset the errors in those calculations over a long period of time. So you just made your state of charge more accurate. So it's fine. That was the reason why you did it. Right?
I'm glad you're here. That's a great way to look at it.
We've got to be careful not to scare people off who currently have a bit of range anxiety as well. These things can happen, but you all live to tell the tale.
For me, it only occurs when I try to be a bit too cheeky, right? So I think the first time it happened was when I was going up to Agnes Water, and I planned all my stops out. I was going to do 3 stops. It was fine. I was going to get there with 30-40% state of charge, no dramas at all. And then the last stop was someone was there already. It was a bit busy, and I can make it. And then I was I got to the point, I'm like, ooh, I'll turn the air conditioning off. It's really, really hot. I'll just crack the windows a little bit. All right, maybe I'll slow down to 90 because it's probably a bit more efficient. And then coasting with 12 kilometers left on the range. And it was a really steep driveway up to my sister-in-law's house. And I'm pretty sure it's going to, to get up there. It was at that point where it was starting to slow you down, and everything else was, it was fine.
Well, you got to know your limits.
Exactly.
And now you know. Don't let it go below 7% is my advice, though.
I want to look a little further into the future.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking 5, 10, 15 years. What do you see in the EV and EV charging landscape in Australia?
I think Australia's in a funny point right now where you can deploy EV charging and all that kind of stuff, and people use it, right? Because you don't have much choice. There's going to be a point in the near future where the market's going to saturate, and your CPOs and everyone's going to have to try to provide more incentives or other services for those customers to get that brand loyalty and have that customer base. And then you're going to start to see those bigger and faster sites start to build up, right? So if you have enough EVs on the road, then there's going to be a commercial demand for those big premium sites where you're going to have, 1-2 mega power coming in, have lots of high-speed EV charging, have a cafe on site, have some meeting rooms and other bits and pieces, the kinds of things you're starting to see over in Europe. So I was in Norway early this year, and they were just doing their first conversion from petrol station. So pull out all the petrol pumps and everything else and completely replaced it with EV charging.
Wow.
And so that was, the convenience store with their nice restaurants. They do amazing burgers and hot dogs in those places. 16 bays of EV charging, car wash with an EV charger at the car wash. So when you're vacuuming, you can be charging your car at the same time and all that kind of stuff. So I think, it's probably 5 years or more, 10 years before we start to see that in Australia. But that'd be really cool.
Yeah. That level of amenity is certainly missing so far. Usually it's EV charging is a bit of an afterthought, particularly at petrol stations and shopping centres.
I wouldn't call it an afterthought. There's lots of rules and regulations involved, right? So, and you've got to think, most petrol stations, they might have a 63 amp supply. They don't need any more power than that. So then you've got to get more power. So is it the fuel station that's doing that, or is the third party coming in? If it's a third party coming in, is the fuel station now running an embedded network to resupply energy and taking on all that risk, or do you have to get a second line of supply? It's a second line of supply. You've got to have the separation rules. So you've got to push out to the edges. There's all these things that flow on that kind of force the layout that you're seeing right now. At some point in time, that will change.
So, Scott, that's just about all we have time for. So thank you so much for coming down to our studio and chatting with us. It's been really interesting to find out your personal journey, but also what NRMA is doing in the charging space. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. It's been a blast. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. That's it for today. Thanks for listening, and make sure you share an episode with someone that you think might enjoy it. Leave us a review, leave us a comment. It really does make a difference for us. And if you need a quote for anything related to home electrification, solar, batteries, heat pumps, aircon, and of course EV charging, head to solarchoice.net.au to get instant quotes from pre-vetted installers. See you next month.